Over the past year of this pandemic, I've had a few thoughts about the way that the media presents the pandemic and the restrictions and the lockdowns and the way that we as a society, as a species even, has responded to this virus. And I've had a few thoughts that have sort of been building up in me over the course of the last 10, 11 months. And I wanted to share them with you and sort of ask myself and ask anyone who might see this a question which I think is both very difficult and very important for us to answer. To give a bit of a background, I speak a number of languages, and it's very difficult to maintain my ability in all these languages. So every single day, like clockwork, I wake up and I make myself a cup of coffee and I go on the internet and I listen to news. I listen to news, obviously in my native English, as I'm an Anglophone, in French, Spanish, Italian, German, Dutch, Swedish, Russian, maybe one or two other languages depending on the day, not every single language every day. And I've been doing this for quite a while, including obviously since the pandemic began. And over time, I've sort of realized something about the way that the pandemic and the corona crisis in general has been presented across different societies. I live in Canada, and our media here has been fairly negative from the beginning. And if you go on any major website like CBC or CTV News, and you go on and you search for coronavirus stories, and it'll be very easy to find because they're about 80% of what people have been reading or listening to for the past year, you're going to find 90% of the stories are very, very negative. That they're all talking about, essentially, in a nutshell, why we need to have more restrictions and why those places that do not have restrictions are doing poorly because of it. And I've also been looking at a number of news channels, like, for example, in Deutsche Welle in German, and other things of the same ilk, where essentially you have a number of TV shows, a number of talk shows where you have a host and you have a number of people sitting around a semicircle, and they have been discussing what this particular country should do in regards to the virus. And the most amazing thing to me was that the way that the virus was presented across these languages was not the same. In German, in Dutch, in Swedish, in French, the way that the pandemic was presented was a lot more sort of neutral and moderate in its approach. I'll give you an example. On Deutsche Welle, there was a show I've seen a number of times where essentially it's a host and a few experts of different types come in and they talk about a certain issue, in this case, the virus. And this host would have people come in and say that we need to have more restrictions for Germany. We need to keep fighting and not give up, and we should not let up now. We have to keep staying home and social distancing. Fine. But they also had other people come in. They had people come in and say, well, I think that the costs of the lockdown are X, Y, and Z, that they're quite high, that in general that this is not a good decision for Germany to take as a country. And it amazed me, coming from having ingested so much American and Canadian media, that the hosts of these shows would always be so neutral and so honestly interested in hearing the opinions of both the majority of people who were in general pro-lockdown, pro-restrictions, and the minority that were generally against it. Whereas in most Anglophone media that I've seen, there has been an incredibly one-sided presentation of the virus. I mean, the simple number of times this past year that I've heard the word grim, it's been at least 1,000 times across 1,000 articles. I think that every week there are 3 or 4 days in which the new numbers for my province in terms of cases, deaths, hospitalizations have been noted as grim by our biggest media companies. And I'm not saying once again that they're lying about something like this or that this is necessarily something that should not be done, but it was rather incredible to me. My partner is not Anglophone, and she consumes a lot of media from her own language, and she felt the same thing. that essentially French media from France was so much more neutral in the way that everything was presented. These lockdowns and the costs associated with continuing the restrictions for a significant amount of time, as more or less has happened this winter so far, were really treated as a serious issue. Whereas here in Quebec and in Canada, and certainly in the United States, from what I've seen, it has been treated as almost something awful. And that the idea being that if you don't think that the restrictions in place are good, or essentially doing more good than they are doing wrong, that you either have some kind of vetted interest, maybe financial, in having the restrictions end, or that you are, for example, I don't know, an ardent Trump supporter. I've even had a couple of times where people who know me fairly well have said to me, well, North, I mean, you're a bit of a Trump supporter, right? And I was completely taken aback because I'm not. I mean, I'm like the majority of young Canadians. I'm fairly liberal, and I don't agree with many of this previous American president's politics. But it was amazing that without ever having commented on Trump or even using his name in conversations about the virus and about my own opinions, which I felt were fairly measured and moderate in terms of whether the restrictions are good or bad, that a lot of people sort of came to think, well, he must be a Trump supporter, or at least a little bit, at least somewhere down the line towards Trump supporter and towards some kind of conspiracy theorist. I'm not sure what it means for us. I'm not sure why it is and that Anglophone media has been so negative this past year. There was a study that came out, I believe, in the end of November, which suggested that American media has been far more negative about the virus compared to English language media outside of the country, and indeed that negative stories about the virus tend to get far more clicks and views and reads and all that than positive stories do. So in the end, I'm not saying that there's a conspiracy, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. My only thought is that there has to be something driving why some countries, or even some languages, seem to be so much more driven to view the virus in as relatively serious compared to the points of views of other languages. Something also very interesting, back in April 2020, I was watching Russian news, and a lot of people were saying, well, Russia doesn't have many cases because they're hiding it. They're pushing doctors outside of windows and so on, and that they really have some kind of incredible situation going on. I think as we've seen their cases rise later on, I think the reality was probably that they simply hadn't gotten, at that time, many cases yet. And people were saying, yeah, well, Russia is basically saying the virus doesn't exist, and they're lying. But when I would watch Russian news, I would see, it was incredible. They had people in hazmat suits walking down the streets in residential neighborhoods, spraying the ground with, I don't know, tequila, some kind of disinfectant. And they were wiping down people's doorknobs on the front door of their building. And they had lots of clips of police officers going up to people in cars and saying, hey, what are you doing outside? What's going on? And yet this is sort of completely divergent from what a lot of people who don't speak Russian or don't live in Russian-speaking countries would have thought. Overall, there seems to be some push to a certain extent to paint the virus in a negative light, to paint the crisis as something that is perhaps, although it is, I do think it is serious, perhaps a little bit more serious than it might otherwise be. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, and the point of this video is that good? Is this what we want? Is this what we should have? Is it good when the biggest news channels in my province where I live always start every day focusing so much on the numbers of new cases and the numbers of deaths, and focusing quite a bit less on any positive developments that we have. Theoretically, this could help push us to act better. By act better, I mean staying home and distancing from everyone else. But at the same time, is it worth it? Is it worth a little bit of dishonesty? And I say a little bit because I'm not talking about flat out lies. I think that would always be wrong. I'm talking about a little bit of exaggeration for the purpose of hopefully keeping society safe. And maybe for many of these media companies also getting a bit more in advertising revenue at the same time. I don't know. I can't answer that question. It's not easy, but I do think it's something that we need to think on. And we need to decide after this crisis is over, or maybe even a bit sooner, how we want to have the media present information like this in the future. Because with the internet, with social media, every single side has so much power to manipulate that we need to be more aware of how it works to be able to be better able to respond to it in the future. Tell me what you think. I'm going to make another video in the next couple of days talking about essentially the importance of media organizations and of the government of disclosing and seriously discussing both sides of the balance sheet, both the costs and the benefits of any sweeping change that might happen. Obviously, in this situation, I'm talking about the restrictions and the potential costs that the restrictions can have. Thank you.